everybody. I'm Nicole Vulcan, editor of the Source Weekly, and why don't you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Emerson Levy, and I'm running for state representative for House District 53. So in Deschutes County, we kind of call it the donut. So it goes all the way around Central Bend. So that includes Redmond, Tumalo, Northeast Bend, and Aubrey Butte, and Summit West, parts of Bend, and then all the way down to Sun River and back up again.
Awesome. You want to share a little bit about why you're running?
Absolutely. I think a lot of us have asked ourselves, how are we going to meet this moment? In the last few years, I think a lot of us, including myself, are tired of business as usual. I have three main goals, and first is to truly represent our diverse district. We have 2 school districts, 4 distinct cities with different needs, and to really bring our voice to Salem to talk about those different and diverse needs. And second is on a position of reform, so to get the money out of politics that has really poisoned our politics at the local and state level and influenced a lot of the decisions that have been made that I don't think are reflective of our community values. And then our third goal is to really return to some type of civility, that we can disagree, that we can talk to each other in a decent way. I think people are craving that so much. I think we're all tired and exhausted, and I think I'm ready, and a lot of other people ready are running to bring in a new type of politics.
Cool. So right now we're still in the middle of this global pandemic. We're here out in this park, yes, so we can have these interviews in safe as a possible manner. What's your take on how the state is handling the coronavirus response, and specifically what the legislature's role is as it continues on?
I think when it comes to COVID, there's a few things we did great, and a few things I think we've gotten wrong. I think on a national scale and on a state scale, the first thing we really got wrong is we politicized public health. And I don't think that's really ever happened in the history of our country. And when we do things like that, when we make masks political or we make these public health measures political, it makes the people who are most vulnerable suffer more. And I think that's what we really got wrong. And I think that's why we're still here 6 months later, because we didn't take the opportunity to take it really serious and to see it as our patriotic duty to help one another through taking these public health measures. I think if we had been more strict with ourselves and as a state and as a country, we could have eliminated the virus a lot quicker. I think what we did right, I think we saw the big heart of our community, and we're still seeing that. People helping each other out, people coming together to help businesses and be creative in the way that businesses can be open, like being outside. I think we really showed the strong and resilient heart of Deschutes County. The legislature has a really important role. We talk about COVID funding. I think that's why there was a special second session. We have to, a lot of the stuff in the legislature is the budget. And so, because of COVID, we had to take half of our education rainy day funds. We have to make sure that the programs stay afloat. And that, I think the last part of the legislature is to be in a leadership role. And that is to be out there in the community and to set an example of public health and of care and concern. People need leadership at every level right now, especially since it's so missing when it comes to the national response to the pandemic.
So going off that, what's the single most important thing the legislature can do to help the Oregon economy recover? I know we had some good news yesterday about the
Yes.
Oregon economy, but undoubtedly there's going to be some other challenges ahead.
Absolutely. So, that was really great to see, an uptick in the revenue by about $2 billion. That was great to see it, but a lot of that came from 2019 taxes that were filed in between. And it's great because we need that revenue. Like I was saying, we took half of our education budget out, and we haven't really had to tap into those resources since the Great Recession. I mean, we had more unemployment claims filed since the Great Recession on one day. So while it's really great to see people are getting back to work, it's still economists think it's gonna take us about 3.5 years to fully recover from these long-term layoffs that we're seeing. So I think we need to get really serious about building jobs and stabilizing the budget and being really smart with the way we spend our money. We need to update our unemployment software. We definitely need to do that in the legislature, but I think that's a Band-Aid. What we need to do is address unemployment. Yes, we need to fix the software so that people can get their claims, because that is part of the labor cycle, and that people shouldn't be delayed like they have been. But also, I think we need to get to the root issue and why are people unemployed? And people are unemployed because of a pandemic that we didn't take seriously. But also, we need to diversify our economy and bring in new jobs.
So on top of that calamity, we now have the massive fires that are still burning. Hopefully got a little bit better with this rain we've had the last couple days.
So grateful for this rain.
Yes. What's your stance on how to manage wildfire risk in the state at the legislative level, and what specific actions are you working on or would you propose?
I think the fires have been really devastating, and first I just want to extend my deepest sympathies to all that has been lost and people that lost their lives and people who are trying to recover right now. I just definitely wish everyone a full and speedy recovery. It's just been a really difficult year and a difficult time, and I think we can't talk about the fires without talking about the human cost that the state has suffered on top of all the other loss from COVID. I look at fires in two distinct ways, and I think when we talk about fires and our forests, talk about them in a sense of the ecosystem. And so it's really hard to look at just the fires in the vacuum. So first we need to address climate change. Our forests are hotter, drier, and because of the long strife in our forest, we do have clear cuts and the lack of the old growth that can make our forests more resilient, which makes fires spread faster. So we need to address climate change, and we need to get better at managing, the conflict that resides in our forests, so that we can create a better ecosystem to make our community hardier and safer.
So the last few sessions of the Oregon Legislative Assembly have involved walkouts from the Republican Party. What would you do as a Democratic legislator to reach across the aisle and really try to get that consensus that we need to handle some of the things you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's another thing that we can't talk about in a vacuum, because you'd want to say that we can all sit down and get together and reach a consensus. But when you looked at that legislation, they actually had reached a pretty good consensus. And I say by consensus, I mean both sides weren't that happy. And I think that's kind of what the legislator looks like sometime. Nobody gets everything that they want. But we can't talk about that without addressing the amount of money that poisoned that session. When you have all this big money coming in because they didn't want that legislation to pass, we can sit down and have a conversation, but when people have bought so many seats at the table, I'm really not sure how effective that conversation can truly be. I don't think that walkouts are effective. We sometimes forget who we work for. We work for the people of Central Oregon, and we owe them to get legislation passed. We suffered a lot because of the legislation that wasn't passed. There was a wildfire bill, there was stuff for the warming shelters, and obviously we didn't have the hindsight, but we should always have the hindsight that we should be forward thinking of what our community needs. And I think the walkout did our community a disservice. I'm sensitive to the fact that people feel that maybe the influence of west of the mountains, the Portland influence, that they're not listening to what Central Oregon needs. And I'm really prepared to stand up to our own party and to have those conversations with our own party so that we can create a consensus. But we can't do one without also addressing the amount of money that's in our politics and who our representatives might actually be serving. So
some of that you mentioned, just the handling climate change, reducing emissions is part of that. What would your proposals be around reducing emissions, if not the sweeping legislation that was introduced in those recent sessions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to address our dependence on fossil fuels. I've seen a few states put together some pretty progressive measures regarding reduction of the fossil fuels and really creating new clean energy jobs, which are so good for our economy. When we look a lot of the stuff that's happened in our timber towns, what we get to is that we need good paying jobs that stay in Oregon, and we can do two things at once. We can address our climate change and we can create this diverse set of jobs. But when it comes to climate change and when it comes to addressing things like fossil fuels, I think the legislators, we should appreciate that we're not all scientists, right? But we need to have a deep appreciation for science and lean on the people who are experts in this field to really guide us and guide the legislation so that we are more prepared and we leave this world better for our children.
Okay. Yet another interesting and challenging thing that's been happening this year is just a lot of protests against police brutality. There were a series of bills that were passed in the short session this year. Do you feel the state has done enough to address police accountability, or should it do more?
Policing, again, I keep saying this, but it's not something that we can talk about without talking about all the other things that brought us to this moment, that brought the George Floyd situation to, global attention. We didn't get here overnight, and so I think it's really difficult to say that we could fix this systemic problem in a couple special sessions. What I'm encouraged by is the chokehold ban. I think that was really a great measure, but we need more accountability within the system, and I know there's a lot of legislative concept hearings led by Representative Bynum, and I'm really excited to see what they're doing. But we need to do more, and also I think we need to diversify our police force, and that, similar to like the Cahoots model in Eugene, where they have unarmed people who work for Cahoots, that one's a mental health professional, I believe one's an EMT. Mm-hmm. It saves so much money, it costs way less money, and they're trained in de-escalation. So I believe that we should have our police and we should keep our community safe, but I think we need to look at ways we can modernize our police force, that our police feel safe, that our community feels safe, and that we've de-escalated situations. And we need to talk about the racial bias and all these things. It's going to take a lot of time to undo a system that has been plagued for a really long time.
So meanwhile, Oregon ranks worst in the nation for both a high prevalence of mental illness and low access to care, and has one of the highest rates of addiction nationwide. What can an Oregon representative do to reverse that trend?
So first, mental health and addiction are two separate issues. I don't want to conflate them, but to answer this, I mean, like you said, we are 50th for alcohol, and I think a lot of people are surprised that it's actually alcohol that plagues Oregonians the most. And 1 out of 4, and then this number's prior to COVID, Oregonians suffers from mental illness. One of the policy groups I really admire is Oregon Recovers, and they have a statewide plan that we can enact as a legislator, which puts us on the same track. So 17% of our budget goes towards substance abuse of some kind, right? Again, that's connecting to all of the things of what happens when there is substance abuse. That could even talk about housing. But 1% of our budget goes to recovery and prevention. So in the legislature, we have the ability to create a statewide policy so that all communities are working together under the same goals, and that goal would be to increase prevention and to put more money in recovery. And I also think we need to modernize the way we talk about mental health and the way that we talk about addiction and the way we treat it, so that people are treated with dignity.
So let's pivot to something totally different.
Okay.
We talked about all the acute issues that we're handling right now, and then here is another chronic one. What would you do to support and fund affordable housing in Oregon?
This is the issue that everybody wants to talk about, right? Because it's so personal, because people want to live and work here in Central Oregon. I think we have to back up a little bit. So and talk about how we got here, where the cost of a single family home is $529,000 at least in Bend. So we go back to the Great Recession over 10 years ago, and housing just stopped for good, at least 6 years. There was hardly anything being built because builders couldn't get the financing. So you have that, and then you add that Oregon, and specifically Central Oregon, is the fastest growing county in the country. In the state, and then Oregon itself is having a huge influx of migration. So we have a high demand and a low supply. So what I support is really also talking about the kind of missing middle housing. I think the way that we can do that, I really like the House bill that came forward, I believe, last session, where we can build townhomes and duplexes and cottages, and so that we can get people into a home quicker or into rental property quicker. Because when you look at how wealth is grown in our country, it's typically through home ownership. And then we have a lot of great affordable housing projects that have come in. But before we look at just blowing through our UGB, like so the growth boundary, like Boise, like Los Angeles, they don't have one. I don't think that's what we want our sprawl to look like. So I think when we talk about affordable housing, we need to talk about what is actually affordable. Because if we have just a lot of sprawl, yes, the builders build the roads, but then that's an unfunded liability that the city and the counties have to pay for. So does it require 2 cars for a family to get there? So how can we release the valve a little bit on our zoning without obliterating it? Because the zonings really can be an important tool to manage growth and to manage our expenses that come from growth. But in a way that really looks at the life of that family or that individual and say, is this really affordable? Is this making their life better? And then just we have to increase our supply.
Would you introduce or support a state real estate tax or property tax on homes worth more than $500,000 to support affordable housing? I know this has been talked about. That's why we're bringing it up.
Yeah, so I think we have to talk about what that tax is and what it isn't. So in the Oregon State Constitution, we cannot have a real estate transfer tax. It was written into the Constitution. So and typically that is how states fund affordable housing projects, right? So we don't have that. So what the legislator did instead is they increased the fee on recording fees. That doesn't get us a ton of money, right? So then they came up with the idea to get rid of the mortgage interest deduction subsidy on houses, second homes. And only second homes that are unoccupied. So that's not Airbnbs, that's not a rental property. It would be second homes that are vacant. This came to the legislator. My opponent had a debate with Representative Kenny Geyer, and then he expressed his deep sympathies for people who might struggle to get into that second home. And second homes are part of our Oregon economy, and we should be realistic about that. I think we need to be more realistic about people trying to get into those homes. So what can we do to sit down with the realtors, sit down with our tax professionals, sit down with our economists to hammer out something that works? I support coming up with something that works. We need to do something. We have to get some funding for this affordable housing. It's an uphill battle to get this passed.
Mm-hmm. And then talking about homelessness, what would you do as a legislator to support people without homes? Would you vote for a homelessness state of emergency?
Again, to back up of how we got here, in the Reagan administration in the 1980s, there was this concept of small government, right? So what happened is on the national level, a lot of these mental health programs were shuttered, and with the idea that the states would come in and create their own programs. But what happened in actuality is that it didn't happen. There wasn't any funding that ever came, and so then we're still dealing with the fallout from that policy, and then from not having funding from the policy as well. Second, we have a high houseless population because of our mild winters in comparison to some other climates and our nice summers. So that's kind of our background, right? And then you put on top of that COVID, which increased our homelessness by 45%, and the high cost of housing. So yes, I do support a state of emergency, and I also support there's a system called the One System that other legislators have enacted throughout the country. It's been successful in red states, it's been successful in blue states, of combining resources to figure out in our population who's chronically homeless, which homelessness might resolve itself within 6 months. And then I also think when we talk about houselessness, we need to talk about prevention, because there's a lot of stuff people can get once they lose their house, but it's when you're on the teetering on the edge, it's very difficult to get any kind of help to stay in your home. And a lot of times people get dug into a deeper financial hole that's almost impossible to get out of especially if your income is cyclical, based on like farming income. You're in this cycle, a bad financial cycle that's very hard to dig out of.
Undoubtedly, when the eviction moratorium ends, that's going to be an issue, and the issue for the next legislative session, undoubtedly, and then maybe the one after that. Do you have ideas around that in terms of, are we going to see a big, set of people become houseless after that goes away?
I think we will. My understanding is that a lot of people are able to pay their rent, but there's a lot that's not. So we're going to see an influx, and we have to look at that from a public health standpoint too, right? If you have people living close together that don't have stable housing, and I believe in kind of a housing first strategy to deal with a lot of other issues that plague our community. So, yeah, I mean, this is complex stuff. It's very difficult, and it's only made worse through COVID. So again, back to the one system of having all the behavioral health, all the city services under one, so that we need good data of what the situation looks like, and we're not really going to have that until maybe even 6 months out from now to see where we're at. But we need to take this seriously. We need to treat people with dignity, and we need to create in the winter some low barrier shelter so that people can have a place to sleep. And also, I'm sorry, there's a project being put forth, being tossed around the legislature called the Turnkey Project. Are you familiar with it?
It's not ringing a bell right now.
So it's this concept that there's a lot of old hotels kind of maybe at the coast or throughout the state that right now we pay for by a room night on like a nightly basis, just like any hotel. So the idea is that the state could buy some of these and we could use them for COVID or short-term shelters, but then we have an asset on our books, right? So we could have an asset that can appreciate instead of just renting, and that's just money out the window. So that's a legislative concept that's being floated.
Interesting. You mentioned the timber industry and some of the influence that they've had. This probably should have come earlier, but I'm asking now. What's your opinion about the out-of-state corporate timber industry in Oregon, and what would you do to make them more accountable to Oregon communities and the state as a whole?
I can't think of a more heated or sensitive topic in Oregon, especially in Central Oregon. Our forests have been a hotbed of political activity for over 50 years, and understanding the complexity behind that, everything from what happened with the science around the old growth and spotted owl, and then timber being exported, and people feeling they didn't have a voice and they lost their jobs. So there's some real sensitivities there, and I always want to use my language very carefully to never diminish anyone's experience. But at the same time, we have timber companies that have come in and they have taken all the timber and they have not invested in the communities. And if you're going to come into a timber town and take precious resources, you need to invest in the town. And there's been a lot of great publications coming out. There's one by ProPublica. OPB just put out Timber Wars on a podcast I really recommend people listen to, because it just shows like how complex this is. But I mean, I really think we do have to talk about Timber Unity and how that came to be. I think people think that Timber Unity is a labor group because they registered as a labor group, and that has been a trend throughout the country to have these groups register as labor groups. But ultimately, this is funded by Big Timber, and it has become a place for alt-right and QAnon and things like that. I fully support the right of labor to organize and for timber towns to stand up for good jobs and what they deserve. I feel like Timber Unity doesn't do that, and the goal is not to serve the people. And my opponent stood shoulder to shoulder with them and said, like, this is why we're closing down the session, under the illusion that it was for the little people, but it's not. And I think we need to be really clear about that. I want to advocate for good jobs and for to help out our small towns and to build our economy, but I don't support doing it under groups that are trying to say that they're helping people, but it's an avenue for other things that are not about timber.
So the legislature has done some things the governor, I believe, made some moves to establish a pathway for interstate commerce in cannabis.
Yes.
Is that something that you support, and what's the path forward after this?
It's such a complicated question because it's such a legal question, right? And I think this is a good thing of having an attorney and legislator. I've been in the legal field for a really long time, and I'm a licensed attorney in Oregon. So we have too much cannabis. Sorry, my voice is a little whatever from the smoke. So we have too much supply and not enough demand because we just can't sell all the cannabis that we have. Oregon is a great place to grow cannabis, and the problem is the second we cross over into Idaho, we've now committed a federal crime because there's not any federal support for cannabis. So the concept of, when we talk about jurisdiction, is typically you have a long arm to reach over and say, well, you're in part of Oregon's jurisdiction. That's not true because suits between states are in a federal court and they are governed by federal law. So an option would be to create an interstate compact, and states have done this on other issues with Washington or California, so that you could cross state lines and sell across state lines. And that way, that supports our cannabis industry. It rewards legal sellers to be able to sell what they have. It brings tax dollars in, which we need. And I think we're going to have to come up with a solution that is guided either by our legislator, but guided by our governor, because my understanding is neither presidential candidate has put forward a plan talking about this interstate issue. Again, if it's popped up in the last couple of days, I haven't had a chance to read it. I'm sure someone will let me know if that's the case. But so this is something that we're going to need to tackle with our neighbors all around us. But yes, I definitely support the fact that we should be able to sell it across state lines. Just how to do that legally and what that looks like is challenging, but it's doable.
We're getting close to the end of our questions. So I want to talk a little bit about the state's gun laws. How far would you go in strengthening those gun laws in the state? And any specifics if you do indeed support strengthening them?
I do, and I'm a gun sense candidate with Mom Demand Action. I know that hunting is a part of our Oregon culture, and I appreciate that. But when we look at what's happening with COVID and the pandemic, most gun deaths in our state are through suicide, and we see that increasing right now. So one thing I really want to push is safe gun storage. I think it's a great place to start, and that means that if you have a gun, it needs to be put in a safe or safe unloaded in your home and away from ammunition. I think this is a really sensible gun reform, and we know when people don't have access or they have to think a little bit longer, it makes everyone safer. I also don't support the loophole that allows domestic violence perpetrators to buy a gun. I think we need to close that loophole, especially with the statistics that, if you're in a situation or an elevated situation, sometimes things escalate only because you had access to a gun. So really safe storage, I just want to emphasize that over again. Safe storage saves lives, and I think that's some policy that we can get passed. I think it's really reasonable, and I really want to advocate for that.
So just correct me if I'm wrong. And in my memory, I'm remembering the boyfriend legislation that did not do that closed the loophole on domestic violence.
Yes, I meant to say I supported that.
Okay.
I believe my opponent didn't. I'm not sure, but as far as like a values-led, that did pass. And
Okay.
I just want to say that I definitely support those kind of changes that keep people safe.
Gotcha. So before we finish, I want to just ask you if there's anything we haven't touched on that's important to you that you'd like to let people know about.
Yes, one issue that I love to talk about is childcare. We have a huge childcare shortage, and we see that women are being sidelined in their careers right now because of COVID and the amount of stuff that caregivers have taken on. Before COVID, we were short 3,000 childcare seats, our spots, and we're putting so much pressure on our daycares and our preschools because they have two options. They can either reduce the amount of kids they have, and then they can't make ends meet, or they increase them and then they don't feel safe. So we have our campaign has a plan, and we've done a few videos. Again, we've done a lot of videos on our website, which is emersonvotes.com. And if there's anything you want to know further, we've probably done a video on it, and we talk about our plan for a shared services model. I really want to champion women and children, and it's definitely the cause of my campaign and definitely the cause of my life. So,
thanks. So before we finish, is there anything that you would like to discuss in terms of what separates you or differentiates you from your opponent? You've mentioned a few things throughout the interview, but anything else that you want to mention?
Yeah, I will always, when it talks about our opponent, when we talk about that civility, I think we should never talk about people's families or anything personal. We should always just keep it to the issues, and that's really what I believe in. I think that will encourage more people to run and more people to get in our civic process if we lead by example. That being said, there are differences. My opponent supports President Trump still, even to this day, and doesn't offer criticism. My opponent has not been accessible to the people in his time in the legislature. There hasn't been a coffee, and that's something that would definitely change. He's taken money from Monsanto, Koch Industries, Philip Morris, and has aligned himself with Timber Unity. I think those are important things that people need to know when they go to the ballot to make the decision. I'm committed to knowing that I would be a legislator for everyone, not just for everyone who votes for me, and to get out there in the community and to do some good work. I think that's what people want more than anything, is to be seen and to be heard and to know that their voice matters in Salem, and that's what I'm dedicated to do.
Well, we want to thank you for being here today, for taking
you.
part in the democratic process, and thanks for just all your work.
Thank you so much for having me.